Thank you very much for coming to my presentation on bullying and incivility in higher education. And really wanted to get you to think of protecting yourself, because I know that's a huge part of this. Much of my research, while I've looked at in terms of academia, I've spoken a lot to academics, but it is important to also understand that our staff throughout the campuses are highly impacted by the bullying and the incivil culture that exists. So I'm going to speak to some of that stuff here. But hopefully what I'm going to try to do throughout is give you moments to write down and jot down some ideas of things I've been talking about, things that are relevant to your experience, and or possibly opportunities to help address or at least put yourself in a healthier situation and context, right? So when we talk about bullying, we're really talking about negative social behavior in the workplace. And there are different ways in which negative social behavior kind of presents itself. First and foremost, there's aggression and conflict. In academia, this is actually pretty normative. And I'm utilizing aggression and conflict in a kind of a broader sense and not in the physical sense. But that is, ranging from debate and disagreement up to kind of, very aggressive kind of, I'd say, verbal conflict. So that's kind of it's a negative. It's where it kind of takes a slant where people can walk away feeling uncomfortable or unhappy about it. But it has not imposed upon itself a part of the culture. Or at least the engagement you have is not part of the culture and you're normally part of. Then we're talking about incivility. And this is, and I'll get into the distinction for that a little bit more in a second of the different forms of incivility. But this is really about not caring about the individual involved, right? And their perception of caring about how we're receiving their behaviors, right? It's usually not conducted specifically directed at specific individuals. Usually the incivility occurs through multiple individuals. But there's also a problem with when that persists long enough, it can affect the overall culture. And you have bullying, right? The larger culture of bullying, which is a very targeted behavior that goes on, right? And then you have the larger issue of mobbing, which is when two or more individuals engage in bullying directed toward an individual, right? It is when it's basically a group bullying in some contexts, although it doesn't always have to happen when two people are bullying a person. It can be, they do it individually, but it is supported towards the same direction in bullying engagement. All right. So these are the different types of negative social behavior in workplaces. Now, one of the difficulties about academia, it is route with negative interactions. Or at least it's set up to be about debate and discussion, which can lead to a lot of these negative kind of interactions. And other parts of academia in general are set up and structured in such a way that they contribute to the increased likelihood of there being negative workplace. In fact, bullying in academia is one of the top two workplace bullying areas. Right? And that is because of the large structure and overall culture of the way that academia has existed over time. So what I want you to do is just take a few seconds to think about kind of what kind of culture do you have? I want you to think about, do you feel it's an overall positive culture, and what to you makes you feel that way, right? Then I want you to, and I'll leave this up for it, are there negative interactions that go on? So I want you to think about, we're going to focus a little bit on the negative interactions. Not that that's a positive thing, but that's what this presentation is really about. So I need to focus on the negative interactions. So choose one of those, one that kind of represents the negative types of interactions in your department or on your campus. It doesn't have to happen to you, but you've witnessed it. And I want you to think about what was the interaction and who was involved in this. Right? What were the people who contributed to it, that participated in it, not just in the specific interaction, but possibly what occurred after. That includes bystanders as well as those who were brought in for responding to it. And it doesn't have to be extreme. It can be, an incivil kind of interaction. So I want you to first get this down. And I'm going to come back to these and talk about what are the types of things that go on in these types of negative interactions. So I'll give you a few seconds to do that. So hope you've written something down that really represent your culture. One of the ones that I commonly see, right, is especially when it comes to staff interactions, is that the administrator in charge of staff members has ridiculed in a public meeting the work of the staff member when in no way, shape, or form did it need to occur in that context. And that very much is incivility, which is leading into actually bullying. Let me give you some examples of incivility. All right. It's rude or discourteous behavior. You got to think about, if we think about what civility, it is the care of the impact you're having on people, right? It is that social kind of contract that we follow. Incivility is ignoring those, right? It is both intentional and unintentional. So we can be incivil to people without intentionally doing that. This is a problem within academia in general because we have a very strong, oftentimes informal culture about what's expected of how we interact with one another. Right? There is consistently existence in the organizations, meaning these are common behaviors that are utilized throughout, right? So it's not that it happens on an occasion. We can have incivil and rude behaviors, right? We do encounter those, but it's when we're talking about an incivility as a regular part of our cultural dynamic, this is why it's then becomes problematic, right? And that is that it is habitual and many times is practiced selectively. And I'm going to get to a little bit later of why that often occurs, but that's because we end up creating a cultural dynamic of which there's practices of it and there's intentional reasons why we're practicing it, right? So this is the idea of what incivility is. There are 5 basic categories of incivility, right? There's basic verbal, swearing, shouting, talking down to. There's the social interruption, right? Where we're excluded from these or humiliated is the example that I gave, right? And then there's also interruptions during meetings, which is denying voice to people. But again, not targeted at this point. With the incivility, it's the interaction of between the people and the engagement that we have without care of how it affects. Psychological, right? That is being created the silent treatment, right? Made to feel there. This is the gaslighting issue, making you feel that it's you have the problem whenever you bring up an issue, right? This is a very negative behavior because it limits people's ability to trust their own kind of perception of what's going on in their own experiences. We've got physical, right? Which this also begins to can get into sexual harassment based issues, but it can be just, these body language that makes us feel and denied, an unprofessional kind of behaviors, rolling your eyes in the meeting in a very public way, meaning you're displaying it to others, and in particular, the person speaking is a form of physical incivility. And then professional impact, right? This is the behaviors engaged in to actually negatively impact a person's professional experiences. Reducing their access to work or workload, or increasing it to make their ability to be successful hard. Right? So you're denying them some stuff so that they can actually do their job, or could possibly develop skill sets to become better, or it's doing the opposite, which is increasing their workload so that they actually can't be successful in their jobs. Right? These are the type of incivil behaviors. A lot of times they're explained away by saying it's kind of the way that we've experienced these. It's part of being in this culture. We're a fast-paced culture, and sometimes you just got to keep up. Right? It becomes the bullying, and I'm going to get to this, is when this behavior starts to be targeted toward people with an intentionality. The incivility is you can have this as a normal part of your regular interactions in your department, doesn't make it right and doesn't make it okay. It's creating an environment and a culture that actually promotes the success of everybody involved. Don't get me wrong. cultures and departments can be positive and still be stressful because there's a lot being done. There's a lot of demand that certain things have to occur. This is part of kind of a dynamic, but it's whether the interactions are intentionally or unintentionally, but they're incivil, meaning they're not caring about the impact on the individuals involved. And that's what we want to think about when we talk about incivility. Having stress, people raising questions about things that have gone wrong is not automatically incivil. It's when it happens in a context that negatively impacts you, and oftentimes in a very public kind of venue. Now, when we talk about bullying, to distinguish it, there is an intentionality to it. So bullying is not unintentional. Don't get me wrong. People will claim that they did not intend it, but you can figure out and determine it that it is an intentional behavior by the continued efforts to engage in that, right? So instance, if you make jokes around people's kind of work, right, that you kind of make a joke about it, when they're not laughing anymore and you persist in those jokes, it is now an intentional behavior. If you're doing it specifically to them, now you're moving into bullying because it becomes targeted. We want to recognize that bullying is a very targeted behavior, aiming at specific individuals. Also note that bullying is about the behavior. It's much less, we want to believe that it is about whatever, I'm not doing good at my job, or they're mad at me for something I did. Right? Bullying is really about targeting the person to take them down. Right? A lot of times we see this as over time. And this is really defined by the relationship between the individuals. And what I mean by that, it's not that we have an explicit relationship, is that I know that your behaviors toward me are intentional about dominance. And that's the other part of this. There is a power differential between the individuals. Now, in academia, there is so much informal power, and that's a really huge part of the power differential, because the informal power means that somebody has some impact on you, but there's not an explicit kind of line that can be utilized to kind of defend yourself, right? But there's also this weird dynamic where they're not in charge of you, but they have some weird power. And we know that exists through academia. So as staff, you may have an administrative leader in front. The person who's in charge and hires you, determines your evaluations, is your immediate boss. But we know that faculty oftentimes see the staff as their staff. And the expectation is you're supposed to support them. And sometimes we push it into a way that's serve them. Right? That can engage in a power differential that is an informal power differential because it's not explicitly defined by the university, but it does exist as something that's expected, right? Which almost times creates a greater problem for what our staff are experiencing. Now, the power determination can be in different formats. We've got the formal institutionalized. For staff, you're much more likely to be bullied by someone that comes from above. Your administrative leadership, leaders are further on up, much more likely statistically, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't happen through the informal. All right. We've also got formal between colleagues, right? Now in academics, we have a formal structure that has, the lectures, you've got the tenure line, but junior faculty, then associates, and then full professors. That is a formal institutionalized power determination in which each level above makes decisions about the group that is considered lower on it. Right? They don't have explicit decisions in terms of my overall work, but they do make decisions about my funding, about my progress, about my keeping my job. So there is still something that's formalized in the institution. But overall, we're all considered faculty. So there is some of that. Now, what we see a lot, when this actually creates a huge part of the problem with the culture, is a lack of structure that exists for power. There's a lot of power that exists out there within academia that is informal, both in practice and assumed. So if we look at someone who has more knowledge, experience, and background, even if they're at the same level as us institutionally, they're given or perceived as having more power because of their experience. And as a result, they have more power in the system of which is expected of falling in, listening to them, following their lead, uh, doing what is asked sometimes, even to that level, even again, when we're at the same level as them. So that's that kind of in practice and assumed. And that informal power structure actually increases the likelihood of there being incivil and bullying type behaviors because there is no formal guidelines of what's right and what's wrong and who has a right to determine it. And as a result, it creates kind of a vacuum where there people then assume positions, and therefore you can also then make mistakes that can offend when they have an assumed position of power. And and that's where the bullying really becomes down to reasserting or establishing the power that is perceived as existing. When it's institutionalized, the power is already defined. As I said, as staff members are much more likely to experience bullying from those who are explicitly their seniors, so explicitly in leadership roles, but it doesn't mean you can't have it in the informal ways. And the key thing to recognize is the more informal types of power and more informal types of culture that exist in a department or on a campus, the increased likelihood of incivility and bullying existing on those same campuses, right? So just to talk about is the prevalence, so you don't feel that if you've experienced any of this that you're alone. We see that anywhere between 20 to 33% of people experience bullying and incivility regularly on college campuses, right? This is their personal experiences. We're much more likely to see that faculty bully other faculty. It can cap from a top down, but the statistically more likely, staff are much more bullied by administration, as I've already identified, but it doesn't mean it can't happen from a colleague or from a faculty member as well. And this doesn't even get into, the bullying and engaged behaviors and negative behaviors of students, of which that really, there's a really interesting dynamic there. And that's actually ended up creating more even hostile work environments. And when we see students engaging in bullying of our staff or even our faculty, what likelihood is that has been condoned by our administration and our leadership. And that means that there's an entire culture of bullying and incivility that is prevalent. We know that 80% of perpetrators are bosses. Now, among academics, again, it's much more likely to be bullied from other faculty, but among staff, we see, again, much more likely. Over 50% of employees have observed bullying in the workplace, and understand that bystanders are as much impacted by bullying as anyone else, right? They're introduced to the culture, to the types of interactions, and become marginalized and distanced from their own experiences within the workplace when such things kind of go on. So to recognize that bystanders are as much affected by these things as anyone else. We see that that bullies who are female are much more likely to target other females within the dynamic. A lot of that has to do with conflict avoidance. And what I mean by that is a lot of the bullying that goes on oftentimes is what they call a relational aggression. It's very much a passive aggressive types of bullying behaviors. This is where denying them access to knowledge or information, or hiding information or misleading them. So leaving them out of email chains. So this tends to be much more passive. It's not to say that men do not bully, they do. They're just much more likely to do it in a more direct way that's just as harmful. So don't get me wrong, this is all harmful. And one of the key things is 70% of people who experience any type of bullying leave the university or college. This is absenteeism, and I'm going to get to the cost that puts upon the university, right? And we also see that 30% of targets have an experience of PTSD, right? So the bullying and incivil experiences that we see throughout our society, throughout our culture and academia, has profound impact. People leave the university, they experience PTSD. This is a mental health problem, right, that we need to encounter. And as identified earlier, the fact that this is actually one of the most prominent areas of workplace bullying that exists, right, raises a huge concern, right? for it, because we also know that this will then filter down to the experiences of our students. If you do not have a safe environment within the departments, within the colleges, within the university, the students will feel disconnected, right? So that is something we also want to consider of why this is important to kind of consider. So I want you to think about the negative interaction, right, that you had talked about. What was the response, right? I want you to think about this and jot down who was involved. You already identified that. What was their response? How did the colleagues respond? How did the other faculty involved respond? How did the administrators respond, right? And the students, if there were students who witnessed it, how did they respond, right? So I want to take you a moment to kind of write just responses, because I also want to ask you, and I'll write down kind of how did it make you feel about that? And I've already talked a little bit about that. So take a moment to kind of write about what you can remember. What were the responses to this? And then how did you feel? And how did you feel? It can be also not just what occurred, but the responses to it. Now, I also want to then kind of point out that one of the common things that we see, and I see the responses that I'm sure you're giving, is that those negative, when negative interactions occur, the responses can be very varied, right? But in a culture in which incivility is very common, usually what we get is people not responding or reacting to it, right? Which that is a condoning behavior. And part of the reason that people do not respond, and colleagues and faculty and students, is because they don't, and actually administrators as well, is because they don't want to then become the target. Right? There's a huge kind of a driving force for, especially for bullying, but also the incivil kind of dynamics. We're also very much trying to avoid conflict. If it's a part of the culture, we're thinking that, well, why would I have a problem? Why should I respond to this if this is kind of a normative way that things occur and engage? Right? And raising those questions of just because it's doing the normative way we've done things doesn't make it right. Right? So a lot of times people don't respond. And what that does is that informs the target that they deserve this, right? And that is their responsibility or fault for it. It also, just so you know, for the colleagues and the faculty and the students in particular who witness this, this becomes then an unsafe culture for them as well. And they're much more likely to kind of remove them from that. Right? The interesting thing is about for the administrators, what we really want from them is responsiveness. And that is actually one of the number one factors that contributes to reducing bullying is administrator response, is leadership response. There's reasons that we don't really do well with this, but that's one of the things that we can get our administrators trained and responsive to these things, to these types of behaviors. This actually can contribute to a lower time. How did it make you feel? A lot of times, what I'm seeing from people is that it disconnects you from the university, right? It makes this a job you don't want to be part of, and as a result of it, you become less productive in your work, and it just becomes a paycheck. Right? And that's one of the costs that we see. Now, part of the issue that we see from the responses, and this is something to think about, is we get a culture and that spirals. Right, from it. So when someone engages in incivil behavior, a lot of times we will then respond in kind because we think they're being rude to us. Now, again, there can be an unintentionality to incivility. Right? So academia in general increases the likelihood of such things occurring. If we have, and the more informal your culture is, the increased likelihood that somebody will offend at some point, and likelihood is they may not be even aware that they have offended. Right? When we have an informal culture, we increase the likelihood of that occurring. And that's something that really needs to be taken account of. Okay? That if there's an informal culture that, we say we're all collegial and everyone is supportive of this, but really, this person over here is the one who deals with the scheduling process. And then somebody gets hired and they're like, oh, I'm going to start working on the scheduling. You've now offended this person but had no clue that that was offensive. No clue that that was the kind of informal kind of expectations of what's supposed to occur at this time, right? Go back to a negative interaction. If the negative interaction is that people call one another out for those behaviors, that's now the incivilness. So if, to kind of go back on this, so if the incivil behavior is perceived as, I'm supposed to be the one doing the schedule, you started working on the schedule, you didn't ask for me, is it because you don't think that I can do the job? You're brand new to this job, how do you know what's good and what's not? This is offended, and it's offending me. Now you've offended me and you have no idea that you did. So in a meeting, I may respond in kind, right? And that's because I think there's an interactional injustice that's occurred, right? I think that I've just been offended by this. You did something that was very rude. Right? So I'm going to respond in kind of the behavior, right? So maybe my in kind, or what I think is appropriate, is I'm going to call you out for your behavior, embarrassing you in a department meeting, right? So we're all sitting there and saying, you know what, so-and-so did this, and I don't think that, we're supposed to do the scheduling that way, and when I normally do it. So now I'm informing you also that. So now I'm evening the score. But what I've just done is offend you publicly and humiliate you. So then now you don't have a trust of me. So now we're creating this lack of trust between one another. We may withhold information, we may be rude, we may avoid kind of interacting. Now it becomes an intentional. Now we're personalizing the interactions. It's you're doing it to me, I'm doing it to you. It's even worse when we perceive the response to be an overreaction. So if I've humiliated you and you're like, okay, I get that maybe I wasn't supposed to do that, I was trying to help, but you embarrassing me in the middle of a public meeting, that is way beyond. Now we have a problem. Now it's an incivil interactions that's going to go back and forth. The witnesses, the bystanders, the other people witnessing all this, eventually they see that as the normative culture between the two of us. That eventually can end up impacting all the other interactions and styles, that becomes a huge part of the culture of the department. Right? And to recognize it's unchecked, unresponded to. Now, there is a way to do this, is you pull yourself out of the spiral by acknowledging the mistake and correcting it, publicly doing that. That is actually shown to cut the spiral off and reduce the likelihood that it will proceed into being a part of a culture rather than interactions, right? So you want to try to avoid where these are normalized, right? What occurs is that then it becomes the norm of incivility in the community. And we also know is that the norm of incivility eventually used on a regular basis will then be used to target individuals. And the personalizing interactions, now we're talking about bullying, because now I'm targeting you for the behavior, and I'm simply trying to create harm, right? Embarrass you, reduce your strengths, reduce your impact, reduce your voice, whatever it is. Now we've got a norm of incivility in the community in which bullying is allowed to persist because it connects to the incivility and the relational kind of negativity that occurs. Right? So this is a huge problem in academia because we have so much informality that persists on this. The reason a lot of this stuff matters, and I'm sure a lot of you know this, is there are some huge costs. A lot of money because of the lack of workload for our employees. The investment of the campus in supporting new hires on a regular basis. Right? The cost of rehiring people who leave, the cost of staff members becoming disengaged, changing jobs, or outright leaving the university. The fact that we have to then rely on instructional faculty, which costs even more, and as staff and as faculty who are non-tenure track, that reduces the likelihood of them being able to get, higher level jobs. Right? Continued cost, the loss of productivity of all the employees, right? Both bystanders and targeted. There's a huge turnover rate, which is cost that lowers productivity overall. We have to go through an entire hiring process, which takes time and energy, and it produces the negative culture, which disengages. It affects student learning, it affects productivity, and affects success. Whether you're an academic or a staff member or a student, the success of the individual and the success of the institution. Now, for individuals in general, and I'm sure you've seen this or you've experienced this, is that if we have individual stresses, regular parts of our lives that exist within being in academia, right? And we have them. Like there's huge part when the scheduling is going on, when the registration's going on, when financial budgetary issues are needing to be submitted, when reports are due, we have an increased regular stress load. Then we have kind of the normative personal kind of stresses. What this is increasing the stresses, right, for the individual, okay, to try to combat all the regular stresses added to it of the bullying and incivility that exists. So we know the individuals are stressed. So increase your stress levels, which we know impacts our health levels, right? Our mental and physical health suffers when we do this. So days off are necessary. And the more days off, the less productive that we are. High absenteeism, work productivity decline. Sorry that got cut off. And then overall change of jobs, which is not good. And the more you change your jobs, the more you carry that with you. And we've seen this when a person changes a job because of being a target of bullying, they're oftentimes going to adjust their behaviors to say, like, well, I want to make sure this doesn't happen again. And when you do that, you set yourself apart from others, and now you are marginalized unintentionally because you're trying to offset before something happens. And now you're treated as an outsider and you're disconnected, and increases the likelihood that then bullying can occur. Right? So we have to make sure that if we change our jobs, that we go with an understanding that it is not our fault, right, that this occurs, that it is a larger cultural fault. It's about power dynamics. And ultimately, a lot of people believe that bullying occurs because the individual who's engaged in the bullying themselves actually has lower self-esteem and trying to build it. They actually are just trying to maintain a power structure, that their self-esteem has been statistically shown to be fine, but they're trying to maintain a culture and a power structure that they think works for them. And they've chosen individuals in order to do that through. Right? So it is as much about the culture of the department and the culture of the community that matters about whether bullying is utilized or not. Now, I had you think about kind of what were the responses and reactions to this. So I want you to think about and write down, was leadership informed about the incident you described? Why or why not? Then I want you to think about, if they were, what was their response? Right? And was it a response that you wanted or thought was helpful or not? So I'll give you a moment to kind of think through that, maybe jot some stuff down, just thinking about kind of your overall situation. Now, I wanted to say about this is that kind of in some of the responses that brought up, most of the time we don't see leadership responding. And the reason is because in a positive culture, leadership responds to incidences. They respond quickly. Although, to be clear for anyone who is in a leadership role, understand you do not have to solve the problem immediately, but you do need to respond to address the issue. So you need to talk about it. You need to identify the action, and that there'll be an investigation or a discussion, and that people will be met. You want to let people know that there's going to be a response. Then it is about thinking through what is the appropriate way. Much of the time is we do not train our leaders how to respond for such interactions and such situations. Most of the time, they try to separate the people. And what it ends up happening is, especially when we've created a normative culture of incivility, that we end up isolating the targeted person and the victim, because they end up, by the time it gets to being informed, they usually are pretty angry and upset, and they're highlighting the problem. And what they end up doing is end up being identified as a problem person or a troublemaker. And really, it's something that's been building up over time. And even if somebody has negative interaction styles and they don't quite fit in because of their communication format, they do not deserve to be bullied in the work environment. So it needs to be listened to and then responded to. And primary thing is making sure that it is that they are listened to, but that there is a response and that it fits within the culture that you've defined for the department. Right? This is why a lot of times having in department meetings or any types of meetings, community agreements for what's expected in terms of behavior, so that there's something to point to when somebody engages in a behavior that's more incivil. Right? A lot of times, one of the prominent community agreements is that address and debate the idea and not the person. But the moment people start saying, like, people who do this are bad, that's attacking the people. Right? Even if they don't specify the individual, that is attacking the person. You can talk about that. Well, I do these ideas because I think it has this effect on the students, on the school. But then you're talking about the idea and the impact, not on the people instituting or agreeing with them. So having a community agreement as a leader gives you something to point to. When you don't have leadership response, it informs everyone that this is the acceptable behavior that can exist. And when leaders try to look for the easy solutions for them, that is problematic, because the easiest solution is to marginalize the person who's already marginalized, and they eventually will leave. Right? What needs to be asked and evaluated and investigated, and this is what takes time, is why is this so persistent in the community? Why is the person keep bringing it up? And you need to kind of delve into those kinds of things. So the responsiveness of our leadership defines so much more. We also need to understand that who our leaders are, where they've come from, may not have been being trained to be leadership positions. So that's on the institution to make sure that we properly train them. That's a structure part. That comes to another part. Is there a clear policy and practice? Most of what I study is how culture and structure respond and create bullying relationships and in civil cultures. Right? That having more structure gives people very clear guidelines of what's expected, and it reduces the informal problems that create incivil kind of spirals. Right? So having a clear policy and practice of how to respond to these negative interactions is a first step that any university can do and any department can do. Here's what happens when these things occur. Right? Even if it goes to this person for an investigation, you know where it goes, you know what's going to occur. Right? So clearly defining what is incivility, what is bullying, having that in the institution. Again, it clarifies it for everyone, so you have something to reference or speak to. Otherwise, it's very informal about, no, that wasn't bullying, that was just, being a good leader, right? That's a distinction difference. So you're going to think about this. Ask yourself, do you have a policy at all or explicit practice on your campus for dealing kind of negative interactions? Or has the campus at least defined what bullying and incivility are? So think about that. Take a moment just to write it down. You don't have to write the whole thing down, but you can just say yes, no, or we're working on it, whatever it is. Let me identify quickly some factors that increase bullying, and these will relate to what responses you can have within your community. One of the key things is what we call the tall poppy syndrome. This is where somebody who is really successful is now growing above the others. And a lot of times bullies are wanting kind of a normative interaction, a very collegial, they call it, environment, in which what they end up doing is chopping the person down to come back to the level. What that creates is a culture in which success is not applauded and welcomed. Right? Now, don't get me wrong. You also have, when you have people who excel, they think they have a right. And that's that informal power that we give to people who are very successful, especially in academia. So we're going to recognize that we don't want to then turn around and give informal power to people who are more successful. But we do want to recognize their success and not take it away. Right? So the tall poppy syndrome is fairly common, that increases it in workplace bullying. The informal culture I talked about throughout. The more we rely on informal forms of interactions and way of decision making, it's when you're writing a policy and say, like, well, but we want to dictate how people do things. That creates the informal culture, which means at some point someone will likely get offended by a behavior. And we want to reduce the likelihood of that occurring. The longevity of community within academia. We work at universities for 20, 30, 40 years. that increases the likelihood that at some point I will be offended by you or you will offend me. And our responses to that behavior increase the likelihood that there will become an incivil spiral between us, which our relationship will become incivil, which could result in one of us bullying the other person. All of that contributes to the larger community. The informal power structure that I talked about, academia is wrought with those, right? Identifying clearly where power exists. So to give you an example of clearly defining what are the roles of every person that works within the department. For academics, it would be much more clear about your promotion process. What does it take to do that? Then it reduces a lot of that power over and more of that they are just facilitating these things. We have in academia in general, and I'm not just talking about faculty and staff, we do not train our leader well. We do not give them the support and the resources to be well trained in order to be able to respond to these behaviors. So one of the primary areas we're looking for to reduce the incivil and bullying culture is perpetuated by the fact that they have less ability because they've not been trained or supported in doing that. So one of the things that should be done is make sure that the resources are set up for leaders to be trained and speaking to the leaders about how do we do this. So people move forward, they are more prepared and better prepared to respond to these. Lack of policies, lack of structure when negative interactions occur. And actually, overall, more clear policies, more structures set up that clarify expectations dramatically decreases bullying. So you want to think about how do you create this in order to reduce the likelihood of incivility occurring or bullying. Creating a competitive environment, right? And that's academia is fully existent of this. Too much competition increases the likelihood that there is a win-loss record that goes on, in which there is a zero-sum game from everything, increases the likelihood of doing this. Competition is good as long as you acknowledge the successes of each, right? And I'm not talking about everybody gets a medal on this idea. It is you can create a competitive, positive environment, not in which the person who doesn't win is denigrated and perceived in terms of on a losing side. So for you as the individuals, your resiliency factors, how to support people, we need to validate them. Right? We need to support them when we see or witness or know that bullying is going on. We need to inform them, especially when we have things like the tall poppy syndrome, when it's work-related kind of directive, is that we need to validate the work that they are doing. And if they need supports and services, getting them the supports and services to support them going on. Speaking to them in a constructive way that supports them, not denigrating and humiliating. Right? Support them. As I said, give them the resources to help them be emotionally and physically healthy and to be successful. Right? And empower them in the decisions they make. We want to make sure that we're not taking everything away from them. Right? So we want to make sure they're supported, validated, and empowered to be successful in the ways they want. Right? Ultimately, we want to make victims whole. So create an environment that has opportunities to kind of do that within the university, having resources set up to do that. Ultimately, they shouldn't be feeling that they should have to leave in order to make themselves whole. That should be a final decision making for them. There should be more things set up in order to support people so that they can continue doing their job and feel supported in doing the job. How do we diminish these? As I've already said, clear policies. Define the values at every department, college, and university because you want to speak to it. If they say they're about diversity, inclusivity, right, and equity, then that should be defined clearly in the mission, clearly in the practices, and clearly in the outcomes of the. And as a result, you have something to point to in every single meeting. Everything should be pointing to this. We should expect this of everybody if that's who we define ourselves as. Consistent and immediate responses, right? Getting our leadership set up in order to be successful and then being able to respond to these. Train our leaders, not just in this, but overall training our leaders of how to be leaders, of not just doing the jobs, but being able to lead people who are now going to be working underneath them. campus-wide training on what bullying and incivility is and how to offset it. The idea of this incivil spiral of getting people to understand that simply stepping back and taking responsibility for your part in it, of your role in it, and acknowledging that I can see now what I did offended you and I apologize, and here's why I didn't even see it, and I will be more account of it. That changes the interactions immediately. Right? It has been shown to dramatically shift cultures because the other people involved realize, oh, we can all take responsibility and you're not going to get destroyed for this. Set up regular mentoring programs, especially for new staff who are coming in and new faculty as well. Wanting to set that up, they are going to be impacted by these negative cultures and have less voice in it. So you want to make sure that you give them the ability to be mentored and supported and to have a space that they can actually talk through these issues. So the mentoring program should hopefully be from people who maybe are not directly in charge or even informally in charge of them. Setting of ombudsman's programs on campuses. There needs to be a pure voice that is outside of the administration, that is outside of the entities that can speak to and for the people experiencing these. And then creating much more collaborative work environments, finding ways in which people work across groups and supporting that behavior. Again, going back to the values, if you want to be a type of environment that is a positive collegial environment, then set up the work environments in order to make that successful, right? And make it possible. So what can be done overall? Thinking about your situation, think about the negative interactions, right? What are the resources that do exist that can help support the individual, the department, and the culture overall? Or do you have things on campus that maybe you can already kind of lean into to support that, or need to be created? Do you have something anywhere on campus that is individual, a mentoring program in which individuals can actually kind of have some place to readily go that is theirs? Right? Having that possibility, setting up, if you can't do an ombudsman, then what else can be done? So thinking through those things for each of these is what's set up to kind of help these things, right? As leaders, we should also be thinking about is what else are possible for, say, in a department? Are there resources set aside so when departments hit that point that they are no longer able to deal with this themselves, that there's resources to bring people in to help them work through some of this stuff? So if you don't, it will not just move to an incivil culture, it will outright bullying culture, which is much more difficult to kind of bring back. What resource can you draw on? And thinking about what are the limitations based on the factors that exist? Meaning, thinking about your college, your department, your university, what are the limitations that exist that would limit your ability to access these resources or make them ineffective, right? Because if you can identify the limitations, you can also then start working on or start identifying ways to overcome those. So take just a moment to kind of jot these ideas down. And as I think about this, one of the things is what happens when you don't have a university that offers the opportunity that is really a top-down model that has established things like this. You want to think of it as how can you support one another in the culture, right? That creating small groups where you can talk about this, then maybe those groups become and support groups. That's really all they are, right? And the mental health kind of aspect, but I'm talking about personalized groups, reaching out to people, right? Those can become committees that can start to develop kind of cultural dynamic, going to HR and working on saying, we would like to create a committee that wants to define incivility and bullying on our campus, right? Involving communities that are going to be much more supportive of this, finding your groups to do this and help address this. So hopefully you can see throughout all of this is that there are opportunities there that can exist for you to change it. In looking at some of the questions and examples of how do we then support people when they've experienced this for an extended period of time. In the leadership roles, it's giving them their time, giving them their time and their leave that they need, supporting them in ways that not setting them up so they're interacting with the people who have been bullying, stepping up. There's instances where you create collegial environments in which people can be modeling that type of behavior, but at the same time, readily calling out people who engage in it. Now, I had a staff member who was readily bullied by people outside of the department. And at one point, when it was occurring, I called them out for it and identified that it's inappropriate what their behaviors are doing. And as a result, I made it very clear that any requests they had for this staff member was going to go through me. So sometimes it is in leadership protecting them, but we also don't want to set up in a way that actually it also adds workload to other people. So, but we want to try to kind of work on those opportunities that can be created. Self-support systems, trying to find resources for these things. Huge thing. How do you change a culture besides creating more structure, creating processes, being transparent with everything, but then setting up supports that can be external and coming in? Also connectivity, working on community. People want to feel connected to their jobs, and the more connected they are, the more they are, the harder that they work. So creating those opportunities where community exists, happy hours, lunches, if people like to do things like going for walks in the middle of the day, creating groups that want to do that. So creating environments in which people can actually engage in a non-work environment starts to change a culture. You change a culture not by changing one thing, hugely, but changing a bunch of small things with an intention, and that comes down to the values that you're trying to define for yourselves. So I hope that made sense. I've tried to kind of hit on some questions that are commonly coming up throughout. I know that a lot of times what happens is that, and I identify this for staff, that it's an administration that's coming down from that. It's you need to look for and utilize the resources that are available to you. And that can include your union representative. It can also include your other opportunities of leadership above you. Utilizing support services. There are ways to also identify creating a hostile work environment. So there are things that can support you outside of your immediate boss. I'm not going to tell you that every single culture can be solved if the university is not interested in changing it. But the one thing I will tell you is then if you're engaging in behaviors and you're informing and the response is to not change, get that in writing. Emails are huge. If you've gone to an administrator and you said, this is my problem and here's what's going on, and they turn and say, you know what, that's just kind of the way that people work, then turn around, send an email to them and say, I just want to confirm that this is the issue that I had brought up with this colleague, and you have identified that it is a non-issue. I just want to clarify that this is what I've reported, right? So put things in writing. I can tell you this, leaders do not want anything in writing, especially when they're not responding to an issue. Right. The other parts of it is support your colleagues, right? Making sure that you validate them and support them as they go through these processes and experiences will reduce the likelihood that they will become marginalized and eventually leave, and reduce the negative impact it has on their health. So looking at ourselves as being positive bystanders rather than the hidden ones, because that'll actually be good for our own mental health and how we can respond. So I hope that I've given you some things to think about, some ideas for responding to these. Obviously, you can reach out if you need anything else, but good luck.